Hello, everybody. It is 12 o'clock now, so let's get started, although I think some people are still streaming in. Welcome to the first instance of Annenberg's series, Conversations on Gender. My name is Duncan Watts. I'm a faculty member in the Annenberg School. And I'm really thrilled to welcome today my interlocutor, Danaë Metaxa. Danaë just recently received their PhD from Stanford University in computer science, but was jointly advised by Jeff Hancock in the communications department there. Danaë is currently doing a one-year postdoc at Stanford in the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society in their program on democracy and the internet, and will be joining us at Penn in the Computer Information Science department starting in fall 2022 with a secondary appointment in Annenberg. And Danaë's research very fittingly in branching across the interests of Annenberg and computer science is on bias and representation in algorithms and algorithmic content. Welcome, Danaë.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Well, sort of here.
Right, to be joining us from the West Coast, where it's relatively early in the morning. So listen, I wanted to start out on a very sort of concrete research focused question. Your work involves something called algorithmic audits, and that is an expression that I think many people in our audience will not be familiar with. So could you just start out by telling us, what are algorithmic audits and why are they so necessary?
Yeah, absolutely. So an algorithm audit, and we usually say algorithm rather than algorithmic to differentiate between, using algorithmic strategies to perform an audit versus actually studying an algorithm, is it's a process that has basically come from the social sciences, where auditing has been commonplace for decades. And in the sort of traditional social science context, an audit is a process of essentially trying to understand the internal processes of some system to which you don't have full access. So this came about initially with audits on things like hiring practices or employment practices, where you can't necessarily know how some employer or some lender, for instance, is going to make decisions about who to hire or who to lend to. But what you can do is send different people to apply and then observe afterwards who gets a loan, who gets a job. And so, by doing this, you can use some inference to understand whether there's some bias or some discrimination happening in that practice. Now, in the context of algorithms, we have a sort of very different, but in some ways similar setup, where when you think about some algorithm, perhaps the Facebook news feed or Google search results. Another common example might be facial recognition systems. You have some piece of software that's run by some algorithm that you don't have direct access to. And so you don't know exactly how that system works. And what you want to do is, again, use that same process, provide some repeated inputs that you're varying as a researcher, as an auditor, and then observe the resulting outputs to try to understand whether there is some bias in that process. So, one very high impact example came from researchers at MIT. Joy Bulwamini has done really great work in this space, and she has this audit on, as I was just saying, facial recognition systems, where essentially what they did was take a series of these kinds of software systems that are commercially available on the market, provide them with a series of photos that are very diverse, and then observe how well those systems perform with those different kinds of faces. And what they found, I don't know, surprisingly, unsurprisingly, is that those systems were actually biased in their performance towards male and lighter skinned faces. They worked best when you presented them with a face of, essentially a white man. And they worked least well, highest error rate, when given photos of women, and particularly darker skinned women. So that's sort of one very high profile audit that eventually led to Joy testifying before Congress about facial recognition systems. And so I think that's a really important piece of this method as well, that because you're studying objects that are situated in society, there's an exaggerated or like a very strong potential for this work to actually influence the world. And to me, that's something that's really exciting, and that's why I've gotten into this line of work.
Can you talk about your own research projects in this space? Because I think it'd be great to hear about some of the work that you have actually done in your PhD.
Yeah, absolutely. So my most recent project conducting an audit was an audit of Google search results, specifically image search results. So what I wanted to understand was, given the set of images that Google has access to and the decisions that's being made by that, behemoth of an algorithm that probably no one knows exactly what's going on, when a searcher actually experiences that system, what kind of biases or what kinds of content, do they see reflected back at them? And also, how does that affect them and their own sort of perception of the world or their perception of themselves? So what I did was I took a set of query terms. These are for common occupations: doctors, lawyers, real estate agents, what have you. And I built a system to repeatedly query Google image search results with those terms. And then I collected the resulting set of images that Google would return. And based on those images, I then had those annotated to understand the approximate breakdown of things like race and gender in those images, to try to understand what is the sort of landscape or the vision of the world that Google is going to show you when you do a search with one of these query terms. And importantly, you usually need some baseline or something to compare against in these kinds of studies, which can be challenging. So in this case, I was comparing against data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US. So looking at, in the US context, what does that field actually look like? What does that occupation look like? Versus how does Google portray it to a searcher? And what I found was really interesting and, kind of disheartening, which was that Google is actually systematically, those search results, those images are systematically underrepresenting women and people of color relative to their proportions in the workforce. So this was about like a 7 to 15% sort of difference. And there's a wide range because it depends on exactly what the query is that you're making, but it seems like across the board, whether that's because of the algorithm itself, the data that it has access to, or some other factors, women and people of color are being systematically underrepresented in image search results. The second piece of that project that I think is also worth mentioning, that's sort of the traditional algorithm audit piece. But the second piece of that project was to then understand what impact this has on searchers, on people who are conducting those searches. So from there, I took those images that we had gotten from Google, and I built these sort of synthetic search result pages, kind of a snapshot of what a search results page would look like, but manipulating the proportion of women and people of color in those images. And I showed those stimuli to participants and had them answer a range of questions around, how they perceived that particular field, what percentage they would think would be different types of people, but also other aspects, such as whether they felt like they would be welcomed in that field if they wanted to join it, or whether they felt they would be interested in being in that occupation. And what we found was kind of an interesting set of findings, which is that in some cases, for instance, looking at people's belief that an occupation is inclusive, indeed, giving more women or more people of color in those search results leads people to think that the occupation is more inclusive. So, that sort of seems like the upshot. But on the other hand, there were some findings that were more mixed. So if you actually ask people whether they're interested in joining some occupation, as you increase the proportion of women in those images, people's interest in joining the occupation actually decreases. And I think this is really remarkable. I think that it suggests some explanations like that of the idea of occupational feminization. This has been written about in social sciences pretty extensively, and it's the idea that pay and other kinds of status markers in disciplines decrease as women's representation in those fields increases. So there's a sense in which they become lower status as there are more women in the field. And we see, perhaps evidence of something like that happening here, where, you would think that, oh, we make a field look more inclusive, people are probably going to be more interested in it. But in fact, across the board, all participants are less interested over those conditions, which I thought was pretty notable. And the other thing that we did then was take into consideration people's own race and gender when they were responding to those stimuli. And this, I think, is really important because maybe it seems obvious to an audience from communication, but in the context of computer science, often we think that the user is just sort of like one default type of person and, is going to behave similarly regardless of who that actually is. But what we found is that when you were looking at something like interest in the field, as you increase the proportion of women, if you separate out the participants by their own race and gender, we see different patterns. So showing more women in search results makes women more interested in the field, but makes men less interested and less expecting that they would belong in that field. So this shows us that, not only can we actually change how people think about the world and their place in it by changing the algorithmic content that they see, but it also tells us that those effects are not going to be standard for everyone. And it's not sufficient to just say, we have one default user and that's who we consider. We actually need to think about who the users are specifically and how they're going to respond. And similarly, we do the same thing looking at race and we ask, do you feel like you would belong in this field as we change the proportion of people of color in those images? Now, in that case, actually, what we found was that across the board, regardless of the stimulus, white people always said that they felt they would be more valued in some field than people of color. And so that, again, points to the fact that it's not sufficient that we just, change algorithms, right? It's important to look at the way that algorithms reflect society, but it's also important to understand that there are some social patterns and social issues that we can't just erase with some technical fix.
Yeah, one of the things that I really love about your work is that you are, you're really sort of trying to think about the technical problem in the context of its sort of social environment, which I think is such a necessary, feature that's missing from a lot of technically oriented work, and that of course is what makes you such a great bridge between CS and Annenberg. But just on that topic, when we've talked in the past, you made a very interesting observation that I'd like you to elaborate on, which is that that researchers like yourself who study bias and representation, in technical systems, are typically motivated by a desire to help people from marginalized communities. So it comes from it's research that comes with a very sort of pro-social motivation, but the very sort of act of doing this research requires you to put people in categories. You've got a bunch of images, you have to label them, you have to say this one looks female, this one looks male, this one looks white, this one looks like a person of color. And your sort of conversations and interactions that you've had with people from these communities has generated kind of an ambivalent response from them about this type of research. Because you're categorizing them in effect in ways that they may not agree with themselves and that may be at odds with their own identity. So can you talk a bit about how you reconcile your you want to like do things, you want to move forward, you want to design your research, but also you're in a sense forced to make choices that make you uncomfortable in terms of your conversations with people who are involved.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you asked about this. It's something that I myself feel ambivalent about, because the real risk here, if we're to articulate it, is that doing this kind of research, or on the other hand, building the systems that are sort of bucketing people and categorizing people from a commercial standpoint, runs the risk of reproducing the same harms that those people are experiencing in society in the attempt to sort of remedy them. And, as a non-binary person myself, I'm deeply familiar with those harms, with the fact that people are very eager to categorize you in a binary way immediately upon meeting you, that this changes the way that they treat you. It changes not just the interactions you have, but the healthcare you can get access to and the employment opportunities you're afforded. So that's a really substantial risk, and it's not one that we can take lightly. At the same time, we are in some cases limited by the processes that we have. You can take the example of, what if we want to do gender classification or to categorize whether someone is a person of color or not, as I was doing in this last project, like, could we do this with machine learning? This is the, first question that I get whenever I talk to a computer science audience. And the answer is like, not well. So there's, one issue is that, the strategies that we have are going to be faulty. And that's easy to point out when it's machine learning, but you can see that the same thing is the case when you actually ask like human evaluators to do that judgment, as I've experienced in my own life. So in that previous project I mentioned, I didn't use any kind of automated classification, because really what I'm interested in is how other people are perceiving those images. And I know that there's still going to be bias in that. Obviously, that is the social bias we all have to, for instance, categorize people in a binary way. But that's sort of that measure, thinking about what other people think of those images, is actually the closest proxy to what I'm trying to get at, which is, what's the kind of social bias and the systemic bias that people have upon seeing some image. So it's really important that you be thinking, as a researcher who's doing any kind of work that does this kind of categorization, to make sure that the measures that you're using actually do reflect the underlying theory or the underlying concept that you're trying to measure, and not to use proxies, which can, introduce all sorts of other kinds of biases. But I think it's also really important to be doing this kind of work, in as close conversation as you can with the communities of people that are affected, because I think anyone from a marginalized group understands that there's some amount of trade-off that needs to happen at certain points. That like, no, I don't really want my gender categorized in a binary way, but I do want to understand how people like me are discriminated against in the workforce. So at some point it becomes necessary to put some label somewhere. And I think most people, are like, understand that and are willing to tolerate it, as long as the benefit to them actually seems, worth it. And it's not for some external researcher to come in and say, like, this is the right type of research to do. It's going to benefit all of you. So sit down and, deal with it. Instead, you really need to be coming up with those questions from a place of membership in those communities or very close conversation in those communities, to make sure that the research that you're doing actually does benefit them in an important way.
I think the phrase that you mentioned earlier was "nothing about us without us."
Exactly. Yeah, this is a term that comes from the disability studies literature and has now been sort of extended in its use to a lot of other marginalized communities as well. Yeah.
Right. No, that's a great message that all of us, I think, can absorb when we think about our research, and when it's about people, we should be more willing to engage with the communities who might be affected. And I think that's been a problem for social science as well as computer science. By the way, I hope that we can have some audience discussion here. So as we're going along, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end to let some of you ask questions of Danaë as well. But for the moment, I wanted to sort of just push a little more on this, this point about, that as you're doing the research, you're also challenging the very assumptions that you need to make in order to do the research. And this sort of reminded me a little bit about, the cultural differences that, in a very sort of, broad brush stereotypical way, differentiate computer science from social science. And so, I'll just sort of characterize these two communities very roughly. So, this is, of course, not totally accurate, but, I think, at a high level, computer science researchers come from an engineering tradition where they like to build things and they like to build systems that solve problems and are very sort of let's just do things in their nature, which I love about computer scientists. They're very sort of can-do, optimistic. Whereas people in Annenberg and in communications and in social science more generally are much more inclined to criticize the very assumptions that computer scientists need to make in order to solve these problems. And sometimes when people from the social sciences read papers that are written by computer scientists, they sort of roll their eyes a little bit about like, well, this is an incredibly naive research design, and you haven't thought about all these things that we spend all of our time thinking about. So how do you, as someone who sits between these two camps, how do you sort of reconcile these two elements of your personality in your research?
Well, I just get to be frustrated both times, more seriously, I think that it's really critical to, at least for me, it feels very important to try to do both. I have been in undergrad, I studied computer science, and I also did science and technology studies. So I've been engaged with that sort of critical perspective, since then. And in graduate school, as you mentioned, I was co-advised by a computer scientist and a communication scholar. For me, that allows me to do the kind of work like what I described previously, that combines sort of understanding of some system or some technology in a deep way, and also to then be thinking about those bigger pro-social questions about how this actually affects people. I think it's really necessary to do both because, certainly work that is simply engineering, just building, or is just studying people or, just doing criticism, there's a lot of value to that. But I think if we really want to move towards systems that are more effective and in terms of their actual impact on the world, we need to be willing to engage in both of those things. We need to be willing to build something and try something and to try to make some improvement, to actually implement something. But we also need to be able to acknowledge what its shortcomings are and what its harms might be, theoretically, what kind of work it's doing in the world. And so, those two pieces, for me, I think fit really well together. But of course, there's a broader challenge around how do you make that work legible to people who come only from one discipline, and is that kind of interdisciplinary work valued? So that's something actually that I love about Penn and that I was, so excited about when thinking about joining. Just the fact that there are collaborations and connections between many different disciplines, honestly, all of the schools, but especially that it seemed like there was a sort of a home for me in Annenberg as well as in CIS, and specifically that the computer and information science department seemed friendly and excited about the kind of work that I do. Because I have to say, often I've found myself really well received in, communication and social science spaces. As someone who brings some technical skills, I think there's an openness to that I don't always see reciprocated in the other direction. I think it's possible sometimes that computer scientists or technologists are ill-equipped to understand the value that those social sciences or even humanities can bring. And so it's really important to me in my own work to be trying to engage with both sides of those questions, because I think that's how you answer the questions best. And it's also important to me to be around other people who are going to value those different types of knowledge generation.
Yeah, I think it's certainly true that, historically, people from a computer science community or from, very sort of technical, mathematical type communities have tended to sort of look down their noses a little bit at, at mere social science. I'm optimistic that is changing a little bit, in part because, of the experience that we've had with the web, where, in the early days of the web, everyone was just very optimistic about its potential, and a bunch of engineers built very powerful systems and platforms that billions of people started to use. And now everything's sort of blowing up in our faces, and everybody's realizing, oh wait, these are not just technical systems. These are systems that are social systems as well, and we have to think very carefully about the interaction between the affordances of the system and the inclinations of people, and they interact in pretty unpredictable ways. So I think, at least in the world, there's growing realization that this is not a trivial problem. But you also have a career, and you have you are sort of in some sense competing with other people who are computer scientists, who maybe don't worry so much about the kinds of things that you worry about. And I can imagine that your productivity goes down because you don't just do the first thing that pops into your head. You have to sort of think critically about all of the assumptions. And I know from my own experience doing interdisciplinary work, if you take it seriously, it takes a lot longer, and you publish fewer papers. And so how do you sort of, just in pragmatic terms, do you find that do you find that to be the case? And if so, do you think it's worth it in terms of the impact that and the reception that it gets?
Yeah. I have to say, coming from the subfield of human-computer interaction, I've found that area of computer science is willing and generally eager to hear this kind of interdisciplinary work. So that's been a great home to be part of. The other point is that indeed it does take longer and make the work harder often, I think, than it would be otherwise. But for me, there's no point in having this career if it's not something that feels sustainable and valuable to me. So, it's important to, it seems good to have a successful career, but at the same time, if you're not doing something that really feels like it's nourishing you, or that, it motivates you in a meaningful way, then why do it at all? So I really do, for me, it makes the work worth it to be able to speak to both sides. And then as a result, I hope that I produce work that other people can tell is valuable, and I hope that it's compensated. But those are kind of secondary concerns, because if I'm not enjoying the work that I'm doing myself, then sort of what's the point? The other point that I think is important to think about is that a lot of the work that has been in computing, but also in social science and in even the humanities, a lot of work that has been done has focused really centrally on, as I was saying, this experience of like a default user or like a default person. And when we see new areas of inquiry like Africana studies or gender sexuality studies, as we see these new disciplines emerge or see them sort of entering in some existing fields, often the initial response is to think of them as sort of niche. Oh, it's just those people who study, the interaction of race with politics, but like they're not really classic political scientists, they're like niche political scientists. Or, there's those people who study, gender in computing, but that's like a niche interest. It's not really like normal computing. And the thing that really bothers me about that is that when you actually look at the breakdown of the people in the world by identity category, more people are marginalized than not, right? When you put together the women and the non-binary people and all of the people of color and the people who are, in the US context, maybe international, and people with disabilities and so on, actually like the vast majority of people belong to some marginalized group. So that work that focuses on the experiences of marginalized people is it is basic science. It is central social science theory. Those theories that speak to the experiences of some people who have been marginalized in some way, that's in fact like almost the most central work we could imagine. And it's the people who are studying some default or expected user who are really, I think, understanding just the very minority experience of people who somehow, don't fall into any of these other categories. So I think we need to, as a, as a field, both in behavioral sciences and in computer science, I think we really need to move away from thinking about those newer areas of inquiry as being niche or as being sort of marginal, because I think, in fact, actually, they are getting closer to understanding, truth for the majority of people than anything has yet.
Yeah, that is just, it's an incredibly important point. And, I think if everyone listening takes away just one thing from today, and there's so many things to take away, I think this one is maybe is a good candidate. But when we spoke earlier, this just resonated so strongly with me, because I think back over my own career and in my observations of the culture in which we operate. It's absolutely, I couldn't, it seems so clear to me that academia, prizes generalization. We prize generality. We want to be able to sort of come up with theories that are sweeping and general, and we want to say things that are, that apply across context, and because we have this bias, we tend to downrate and marginalize research that is about marginalized people. We think this is very niche stuff. It doesn't, it belongs in a specialized secondary journal. All of the sort of penalties that we impose, and yet, listening to you, I think that we've got it precisely backwards. That I think what you said to me before was that the only thing that generalizes is that experience is specific. That's the generalization.
Exactly. Right. I mean, as anyone that comes from science technology studies will tell you, all knowledge is situated knowledge. Mm-hmm. The context of the person who's doing the research and the context of, in which the research is done has a massive effect on what kinds of questions we ask, what kinds of questions get funded, what kind of findings we're open to, how those findings get published. The entire process of doing research or of producing knowledge is very context specific. And so indeed, right, as I was saying, the only thing that generalizes is that experience is highly specific. And if we're not acknowledging those specificities, I think we're really not going to produce knowledge that's useful to anyone except those in that small minority of being considered, the general person.
Yes, I think it's worth belaboring this point a little bit, because I think the bias is, I can just sort of imagine, some of my colleagues, reaction to this, yes, but, some things generalize, right? Surely, and my mathematical model, or my my simulation, or my thought experiment, or my theory, and those, surely those things are more scientifically important for that reason. And even the expression, there's nothing so practical as a good theory, is, I think, really a manifestation of this perspective, which I have sort of have been totally guilty of, for many years. And I now I sort of wonder, maybe we just made all this up, right? Because it it suits it works for the people who have been running the show for so long, namely people like me, white men who have been dominating in academia as they have in every other institutional environment. It works fine for us because we get to pretend that we're the dominant case, or that whatever seems reasonable to us is dominant. So this, I think, is a really profound challenge, and I just would love to hear some more thoughts from you about how do we sort of explain this to people?
Yeah, I also want to just draw attention to the comment that Jessa Lingle wrote, which is around referring to Wendy Chun's work on algorithmic bias as a diagnostic tool. The idea that, for instance, the example is that Amazon's AI recruiting tool, they had built a system to automatically screen resumes, and they found that there was a lot of, racism and sexism being reproduced by that system, and so they just kind of decided not to use it anymore. But Wendy's argument is that you could, rather than just scrapping that tool, actually use it as a diagnostic for finding discrimination in the workplace. I think I'm so glad that you brought this up. Wendy Chun was an advisor of mine during undergrad, and someone that I've looked up to really since then. So I love her work, and algorithm audits as a sort of broad category of research are used in many different ways, including sometimes internally at some company, just to understand if the system they're building is to specification, whatever that means. It's also a system or a process of inquiry that gets used by journalists, for instance. One very high profile example was looking at, in the legal system in the US, some algorithms that were being used to assign risk scores to defendants and looking for bias there. So in addition to being used by academics in the kind of work that I'm doing. So there's really a wide range of applications for algorithm audits. And as Jess is pointing out, one of these is to use them as sort of diagnostic tools, that if you know that some system is going to produce some kind of bias, you could use it to sort of preemptively identify those biases. A risk, of course, is this particular tool, let's say, that Amazon has created to review resumes. Certainly there are some kinds of biases that are going to be obvious, but maybe there are other kinds that you wouldn't necessarily notice. And so the tool might be, in other words, it might not produce all kinds of bias, and so it's kind of limited then in exactly what it can tell you. But if we know that it reproduces things like racism and sexism, then we certainly could be using that system to identify those proactively. And that is very similar to what algorithm auditing does. You're sort of building a system to identify those kinds of patterns. And it's worth saying that, usually the goal of algorithm auditing is to change that underlying system to be, better in some way, to perform better on those metrics that you found it wasn't performing well on. But I think it's also worth having a conversation about when not to conduct an audit. Because of the possibility for leading to this kind of social change, scholars, like I'm thinking of particularly Os Keys, for instance, have pointed out that it can be used as a tool to legitimize some system that shouldn't exist in the first place. That, if you audit some system for some particular measures and you find that it performs well on those measures, that doesn't necessarily mean still that the system itself is ethical or that it should exist, right? It really can only say that on those particular metrics, the system is performing as you might want it to. So I think as auditors, it's really important to be having, and this goes back to the point about needing to do humanistic work along with technical work. As an auditor, you need to be in a position not just to build some system that's going to help you evaluate some bias, but also to think on a more meta level about how this algorithm, let's say, functions in society, what kind of effects it has more broadly, and to be willing to ask the question, should this technology even exist? If we're not willing to ask that question and we're only willing to say, well, we tested it for XYZ attributes and it does okay, as auditors, we're going to run the risk of legitimizing systems that are inherently harmful and that, simply we should be pushing back on wholesale.
Is there an example that you were thinking of when you say that? Anything specific?
Yeah, well, there's any number of them, but for instance, some of the work on facial recognition systems, the conversation around that work has become, I think, more nuanced and more interesting over time because, initially the findings were just, these kinds of classification systems are performing less well on, let's say, darker skinned faces. But when those systems begin being used by police forces, let's say, to identify people from closed caption footage, we have, as researchers, to ask the next question, of course, which is, do we want the police having more accurate tools to identify people by face? Well, certainly the answer is not, we want less accurate tools, right? That's how people end up incarcerated who shouldn't be. But we also just don't necessarily need to accept the premise that this is a tool that the police should be using. Or perhaps even the premise that like we need the police to exist in the current incarnation the way that they do now. We need to be willing to ask those kinds of bigger questions, because otherwise the work that we're going to do is going to be so myopic that we're really going to miss the bigger picture.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that you really put your finger on something there, that when we look at the role of algorithms in particularly the criminal justice system, we sort of miss a little bit that they're a part of a whole pipeline, like a whole process. If we think about sort of decisions about whether to grant an accused person bail, and there's been a lot of focus on that particular system, but by the time somebody arrives in the courtroom, like a bunch of stuff has already happened, and nothing that you do about the algorithm is going to affect any of that stuff. So how do you sort of, if you panning the camera back a little bit from the algorithm that's being audited, like what's your sense of like how much of the problem is in the box that the algorithm is responsible for versus the rest of the process that from beginning to end?
Yeah, honestly, I think it's very rare that the problem is just in the box. Most of the time, whether it's because of the data set that this algorithm was trained on or the people who built it, there's some bias somewhere upstream that has caused the current form of discrimination or bias or unfairness that you're seeing when you study that algorithm. And I think as researchers, then we have this responsibility to be thinking about our work both as a type of activism and also as a form of harm reduction. It's activist because we have the ability to influence society. When news outlets take up these kinds of findings and publish them, real changes can occur. Or when you bring, in fact, those findings to companies, they might change their tools accordingly, which could have some benefits. That tool is now maybe less biased in some way, and also some drawbacks. Now the police can more effectively target people. So it's really, we need to be thinking about those broader social effects. Ostensibly, that's what got us into this area of inquiry in the first place, that we were interested in looking at some algorithm that's situated in the real world and has real world impacts. So we need to be really willing to not just, we can't just pick and choose and say, well, I care about it because it has real world impacts, but only to the point until I've published the paper and then I'm going to move on, and I don't care whether that algorithm gets used by the police or anyone else. I think we really do need to be thinking about the whole, the big picture. And that's something that is, I think, at least in my experience, more accessible as a concept to scholars from a field like communication than I have found it to be in computer science. But and the other piece is to think about this work as a form of harm reduction, or at least to be exploring other potential framings for what the work does in the world. This is something that's at the moment kind of hotly debated between various scholars and activists, between sort of computational tools and social impacts. And I think that there's some miscommunication happening on both sides. I think on the side of computer scientists, there hasn't been a rigorous understanding of the total social effects of these systems, that it's not sufficient to just build a better system. You actually have to think about then what that system gets used to do, and is that something we're willing to tolerate? But on the other hand, I do see the inclination sometimes from the sort of more activist direction to just say, like, wholesale, let's not ever engage with those systems at all. The problem with that is that most of these algorithmic systems are taking the place of human judgments. Human judgments are notoriously biased. It's, we don't want to say like, it's bad to use an algorithm, therefore let's let judges make decisions about bail single-handedly. I mean, when you think about that, that's just one person's bias that is getting reproduced at large scale. And who is that person? It's someone who's had access to a lot of resources and a lot of privilege over time to end up in the position that they are most of the time. So if we want to impact people's lives for the better, I think we need to understand that there can be some role in using automated tools, for instance, because at least they're applied the same over everyone, and at least we can audit them more explicitly for bias, and we can change them. Good luck getting some judge to change that person's implicit biases. That's not necessarily going to happen. So, there can be some benefits that using algorithmic tools provide if they are monitored really closely. There are other risks that come with using some technical infrastructure that maybe wouldn't exist if you were using a person instead. And at a meta level, there are other kinds of work that we need to be doing in the world to, for instance, fundamentally change those systems that are having one person or one algorithm decide whether someone is, able to live freely or is incarcerated for the rest of their life.
Yeah,
we need to be doing work on all of those levels.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I agree with you. I think that distinction has been sort of left out of a lot of the contemporary debate that the algorithm is there because the system before the algorithm was also terrible and biased. And indeed, part of the reason the algorithm may be biased is because it's been trained on data that was generated by this biased system. So there's sort of no bias-free system, right? And just rejecting or criticizing algorithms does not solve the other problems that we've always had. So I think the research would be stronger and more constructive if it sort of acknowledged that point. So I thank you for bringing that up. We're the title of this conversation is from audits to accountability, and we've been talking a little bit about holding companies or designers of algorithms accountable. But I'd like to finish on sort of a more personal note, and something that's a little closer to our home as well, which is you're not just someone who does research on bias and representation, but you're also a human being who exists in a professional community and also in the outside world. You mentioned that you identify as non-binary yourself, and we've talked about how your sort of the difference between identity and perception and representation, and how that's changed for you over the years. And part of your experience has been doing all of that in a professional community, mostly computer science, that is not has not historically been very inclusive and has been guilty of bias and outright harassment, and we've seen some high profile cases recently that have been really sort of shocking to many of us who think, we didn't know this was going on, and clearly it is going on, and it should force us all to wonder, well, is it happening in our community, and how can we be holding ourselves accountable, and who can be doing the work to make sure that our community, whether it's Penn, whether it's the computer science community that we're involved with, or the communications community that we're involved with, is more inclusive and is better able to accommodate people who identify differently.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously something that's very dear to me as a question, because it's true that coming from a discipline that is very homogenous and not always the most accepting, I have had my fair share of bad experiences. The thing that I've really taken away from those is that as someone who is not in the majority, or sort of in that hegemonic group, the toll that takes, and I don't mean emotionally, but practically in terms of time, is massive. The amount of extra time that it takes, and anyone who does sort of interdisciplinary work, for instance, can resonate with the idea that it takes extra time and effort to make your work understandable and legible to others. So that's sort of one time sink. But then when other people are systematically discounting the kind of knowledge that you generate, or they don't treat you as an authority despite your having earned it, these are other opportunities for you to put time into kind of shoring up your own credibility or your own work that your peers don't necessarily have to do. The result of that is that the systems that we're using for sort of explicit and implicit that we're using for evaluating people, those themselves are biased. When we measure someone's productivity by like the number of papers, for instance, that they're producing, we really miss all of the extra community work that they're doing, some of it voluntarily and some of it out of necessity. And so I think it's really important that we open ourselves to the possibility that people are providing value to the community in a lot of different ways, many of which we haven't been explicitly counting. And some of the solution is to explicitly count that labor, and some of it is to simply work to make our communities more diverse, though, you know, I kind of hate that term as a, I think in a lot of ways it's not enough. It's important to change the fundamental makeup of our communities so that people don't have to be doing that kind of extra labor. And again, as I was saying before, to be doing that on a broader social level, because, you know, we can't have an academia that is truly going to treat people equally or is like meeting some meritocratic standard while it's situated in a society that has, you know, so many fundamental issues. Something I just wanted to also call attention to this great point by Joseph Turo in the comments, asking about the audit that I did previously and thinking about, like, you know, when is an audit good enough? What do these quantitative metrics actually give us? You know, if we find that search results, for instance, match the proportion of people in occupations, does that mean that they're good enough? Has that sort of solved the problem? And these are really, really like exactly the important questions. The reason to do something quantitative, I think, is to be able to track how things change over time. So when I did this audit, I was comparing against results from 5 years ago, after which there were a bunch of news articles and other kinds of publicity that led Google to make some claims that they had improved their algorithms. And the reason that it's worth knowing what those percentages are now is because they were not statistically significantly different from Google 5 years ago. So by measuring things, we can sort of track that trajectory over time. And I think that that's valuable. But the other point is that, yeah, we absolutely don't stop at what's the proportion in the population, and then we say that that's fine, because as I was just saying, right, like society itself has so many issues. We know that that's not the gold standard. And that's why it's exactly important to do the behavioral science work to say, let's actually see across the whole range of possible things Google could do, or any system could do, what's going to be the effect on people. In particular, what's going to be the effect breaking people out by their own identity categories? What's going to be the effect on the most marginalized people? Because to me, it's not acceptable that we meet some standard of what the world is doing. The standard that we need to be meeting is to be trying to benefit those people who are the most marginalized, which I guess, you know, ties back into what I was just saying around how these how our academic communities need to be changing over time. We need to be making those spaces that are going to be conducive to the most marginalized people doing, you know, the best that they can, like to be able to do their best work. If we don't have communities, or we don't have opportunities for those people specifically who have been most marginalized, who have faced the most obstacles, we definitely know that we're going to be, first of all, failing a large portion of the population that has already been failed over and over again. And to me, that's the most important part. You know, and secondarily, we know we're not going to be producing the best knowledge that we can, because we're discounting systematically the experiences of large numbers of people. But, you know, again, in that order, I don't think it's enough to just say, oh, you know, we do diversity because it helps our field generate knowledge. No, like we do that because that's the right thing to do, because it's unjust that massive sets of people have been systematically disenfranchised. Additionally, you know, I think it's going to be better for all of us if we make those efforts.
Yeah, the new director of the National Science Foundation likes to talk about the missing millions and how, you know, talent is evenly distributed, but opportunity is not. And I think this is a good time to be having this conversation. But the challenge, I think, is when the rubber hits the road, like who's doing the work. And I want to come back to your point that Sarah Danaë Weiser just highlighted in the comments about what it means to count labor in these contexts. And in my limited experience, when in large organizations, when we try to do something about diversity, for example, often it falls heavily on the shoulders of the people who are underrepresented to do the work. And I guess one thing I would like to hit on before we finish is, how do the rest of us help do the work? How do I help do the work, right?
Yeah, well, I think the answer to that, at least in my opinion, is that unfortunately some of that work is only going to be able to be done by people who are in those more marginalized positions. There's some amount of educating and advocating that's really only going to be effectively done by people who have direct knowledge of that position. And so the best thing that the rest of us have to do when that's not, our specific experience is to, I hate the word compensate because it's not really about paying, but to compensate that labor, to make that labor worth it, to make it count in, in the context of academia, in hiring decisions, in tenure decisions, and so on. It needs to be, we need to set up an academia or a society in which people are able to do that kind of work that they want and or need to do, and to actually see benefits from doing that. And not just the benefits of, maybe in 20 years, my field is going to be a little bit less white and a little bit less male, but like it needs to be immediately beneficial and certainly at the very least, not detrimental to my career to be doing that kind of work. So I think we need to be basically setting up systems that facilitate the doing of that kind of labor, because the labor itself has to be done. And we know that it's going to get, disproportionately for various reasons put on the shoulders of the people who are already, suffering.
Right. And so just to be very concrete, when we're thinking about tenure and promotion and hiring, we should not be just focused on the, the sort of lines on the CV, but we should be thinking about like, what did that person have to do to get where they are? I think this is a very difficult thing for many people to understand, right? And I've been in conversations like that, and it's easy to sort of wheel out the meritocracy trope and say, oh, look, we're just evaluating based on displayed competence here, like that's totally objective. It's very hard for people to see these structural disadvantages. How do we help them see that?
This is a great question. I guess that's the sort of $1 million question or something. For me personally, the answer to that has been to do this kind of advocacy in my work, to do it both explicitly in the research questions that I'm asking and answering, and also personally in the rest of the efforts that I'm engaged with. I do a lot of advocacy in the communities that I'm part of. Largely, in many cases, with the end of trying to make this kind of work or those experiences more legible to other people who otherwise, would be sort of systematically discounting them. So that's not like a particularly sexy answer, but it's just hard work. It takes trying to translate between different people's, usual forms of knowledge and understanding. It takes showing up and advocating for people who otherwise, wouldn't necessarily have some ally in that room. It takes, I think, shifting the focus of the research we're doing ourselves to study these kinds of issues that we all say, oh, they're very important, but then we leave it to the marginalized people to actually do that work. It takes mentoring students from a wide range of backgrounds, even when that's going to be more effort to train somebody who comes without, the prerequisite knowledge than it might be to train somebody who's already had several mentors and has already been in the field for a long time. It takes the expenditure of effort on a personal level all the time.
Danaë, thank you so much for this conversation. We're at time now. I've learned a tremendous amount from you already. I am really thrilled to welcome you as a colleague next year. I can't wait for you to show up on campus and to help us all with our research and thinking about these broader issues of how it interacts with society and with our own cultures. So thanks again. This has just been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And if anyone has any further questions or wants to talk more, please send me an email.
Fantastic. Bye for now.